Broncos country, we welcome you into the Broncos studio for an edition of Altitude Advantage. I'm your host and team reporter, Elisa Hernandez, alongside our lead writer on DenverBroncos.com, Aric DiLalla. We are a week away from the 2025 NFL Draft, and on Thursday, we heard from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton for their pre-draft press conference. This will be their third draft together. There's a lot of consistency that's kind of going into this draft. It's kind of good to see them on the same page for sure.
Yeah, the pre-draft press conference is always interesting, right? Because they're doing their very best to give away absolutely nothing to other teams, and you try to get a little bit of insight into what they're thinking for this draft. You know, what are the priorities going to be? Kind of where do they view the strengths of the draft? You can get a few nuggets here and there, right? But also at the same time, every team never wants to reveal anything. And I think back to this time last year, when the Broncos, you know, George Paton, Sean Payton, they were talking about, we're going to trade all the way up into the top 5. You know, Sean Payton's making it seem like they're going to go get somebody, and then they stay put at 12. They get Bo Nix, and at the post-draft press conference, Sean's like, I did a great job tricking everybody. Like, that was my job to make it sound like we were going to move up. So there are certain things that you take from a grain of salt from this press conference, from any of the pre-draft press conferences around the league. But I do think, like you mentioned, one thing that is true that we can take is that the consistency here helps. And I think it helps in a couple of ways. One is that you just know what type of player you're looking for, right? Like the Broncos, the last several years before Sean Payton arrived, whether it was a different coach, a different GM, like every couple years they were shifting kind of the type of player they were looking for, the system they were trying to fit that player into. And so now that you're going into year 3 of this partnership with Sean Payton and George Paton, they're on the same page. They know what they're looking for from a talent standpoint, from a characteristics of these players standpoint, from a mental makeup, you know, character type standpoint. And Sean Payton talked about how much he enjoys this process. And he said, listen, we're in there all day looking at different position groups, whether it's, you know, the early rounds or we're stacking guys that maybe are going to be available round 4, round 5. And he said, like, we're sitting right there with each other. We're so close. I drank out of George's water bottle the other day. And so this is part of the process that I think people that love football, they love this aspect of it. And when you have 3 years of experience together, it makes things smooth. And we heard George say, like, this is the most prepared I've ever felt, and it's because of that consistency.
Yeah, and he also mentioned that they're aligned and they have a very clear vision of what they want to do. When you look at the success of George Payton's draft classes, he's pretty good at drafting because he's gotten some pretty good guys, especially some that have gone on to be in the Pro Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, that's an understatement, right? Like Pat Surtain, his first ever draft pick was just Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, no big deal.
You know, you think about
all the time.
You think about Quinn Miners, who was drafted in the 3rd round, All-Pro. Nick Bonito, second team All-Pro that they found in the 2nd round. Marvin Mims traded up to get him late in the 2nd round. All-Pro. So, like, the Broncos, I don't want to say problem, but like they haven't had those picks as much. So it hasn't been like a not finding these players. Like George Paton and Sean Payton, since he's been here, they've really hit on a lot of these guys. If you think of the Marvin Mims trading back into the 3rd round to get Riley Moss. I mentioned Jonathan Cooper. You think of like how good, and we'll get to receivers a little bit later, but like how good a Devon Vele was as a steal, right? Jonah Ellis, I think, showed promise. And obviously, and we'll talk more about him as well, Bo Nix, hitting on him as the 6th quarterback in the class who was off the board. But if you did a redraft now, it's quite possible he's the 1st or 2nd guy that would come off the board at the quarterback position. So it hasn't been a talent evaluation thing at all. It's just been, obviously, you look back at the trades, both for Russell Wilson and for Sean Payton to come to Denver, it affected your 1st round capital, your 2nd round capital. But man, I think you talked to, I think it was Ian Rappaport, or maybe it was Tom Pelissero down at the annual meeting, and they were saying, you know, George is as good as any GM in this league at evaluating talent. And then you add in, hey, Sean Payton knows what he wants from a player. He has this vision. I think we heard him talk about that again on Thursday of like, you've got to have a vision for this player, right? And you've got to know how you're going to use that player. And there's 2 elements of it. You want to fall in love with the player in terms of the physical attributes, how they play, type of person they are. But then it can't just be this player that like is great in a vacuum. They have to fit in your system. And I think that you've got George Payton's ability to find that guy, Sean Payton's ability to know this is exactly how we're going to use Troy Franklin, right? And then it ends up, or Bo Nix is a great example of like the fit mattering. And then you end up in a really good spot. And so, yeah, excited to see them stack another draft class. And I think you have to do that. As you hear Sean Payton talk about, we've got to take this next step. just because you had a great draft class last year or the year before, like you've got to keep doing it or else you find these gaps. And if you look back at the period of Broncos history where they struggled between like 2016 and 2021, 2022, or maybe 2020 if you want to call it there from like a draft specific standpoint, because obviously the 2021 draft was so good. But like you just had these draft classes where there weren't a lot of guys that stuck around long term, and there's some, right, like a Cortland Sutton, a Garrett Bowles, Justin Sternad obviously was a guy from 2020 that stuck around, but you look at it and it's like you weren't hitting 3 or 4 or 5 times, and you've got to do that to continue to build your team. And I do think where they are right now from a free agency standpoint, you can afford to look at, okay, what is this guy going to be in 2 or 3 years? Right. George Payton talked about, they were just looking at, I think they said D lineman, right? Where, hey, here's one guy, he's ready to come in and play right away. Here's another guy, he might take a couple of years, but maybe his ceiling's higher. You've got to weigh those things. And the way they met needs in free agency, I think they can afford to maybe get some guys that, hey, we're projecting 2 or 3 years out, but they're going to be really good football players. And that's how you build your roster for consistent success. It's not just like plugging holes, because I do think the Broncos, we've talked about it before, you signed Garrett Bowles. There's not a lot of holes right now, so they can afford to be picky kind of and find that good player that they're going to add.
Well, they mentioned that obviously having a really good defense helps out your quarterback. It's not just about trying to find those receivers, but also finding the full picture of how you guys can advance into that next level, because other teams are also drafting too. They're also looking to get better, especially in this division that's so tough. And when you look at the 2024 draft class that had, I believe 6 of the 7 players that were drafted ended up making the roster. So the way that they've been able to kind of catch lightning in a bottle, it's hard to replicate. But when you look at this draft, how do you see Sean and George kind of look at the strengths and weaknesses of this class kind of coming in?
Yeah, and you mentioned 6 or 7 making the initial. You also had Nick Gargiulo like later, who ends up being on the active. So all 7 of those guys really options kind of as the Broncos move forward. But yeah, I think in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, one thing that stands out, and we've heard this kind of nationally, right, is that maybe it's not like as star-studded of a draft as you see sometimes, and that it's a good starters draft. You're going to find some really solid players. And I think we heard both Sean and George talk about that, where they said, listen, maybe we do have fewer players that are first-round grades, quote-unquote, than a normal year, but there's still really good talent there. They mentioned running back, which we'll talk about, defensive line they talked about. And so there's still, and obviously we know, I think especially toward the top, there's some really good receiver options. But I do think what stands out is that maybe there's not as many guys in the top 10 that George seemed thrilled about, but then you talk about from the 10th pick to the 20th pick, he's mentioned this 2 or 3 times now, that there's a consistency in talent and that you might be able to get the same type of player at 20 that you get at 10. And obviously a lot of different players have been mocked to the Broncos, whether it's a Colson Loveland, an Omarion Hampton, Ashton Genty falling, and Emeka Egbuka, like you could go on and on and on. But I think, and again, they're not talking about these specific players, but talking about, hey, the general skill level or the type of guy you're going to get is about the same. That's encouraging, because you don't want it to fall off at like 15, right? Because then it becomes more like, okay, well, do we trade back or do we trade up? It gets a little trickier. But when they see that consistency in talent, it's more like, okay, let's rank the board, let's see who's there, and now let's make a decision. And then I think the other thing they mentioned was that from the 2nd round through maybe like the 4th or 5th round, there's really good mid-round talent. Yeah. And I think that, and Sean Payton mentions this a lot, some people tune in for round 1 and they look at the 1st round pick, and then they're like, we're good here. And I listen,
we're done.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of investment to be really dialed in for all 7 rounds. But you think about the last couple of years, whether it is that Jonathan Cooper, Devon Vele, Riley Moss in the 3rd, or Quinn Miners, like
they've had success.
You get Quinn Miners in the 3rd round, and it's like, okay, well, should I be fired up on draft day about a guard from Division III, Wisconsin Whitewater? It's like, you got to really love the draft to get fired up about that, but then you fast forward 3 or 4 years and now he's a first-team All-Pro. And so those are the types of guys you can find, and I think the fact that they view this as kind of like the meat of the draft being in those rounds, you could end up with some guys that are really solid, and even Pro Bowl type, like Bonito, Mims, Miners, all those guys came from day 2. And so Cortland Sutton, like, it's not just a 1st-round draft, and the fact that the Broncos have 2 other top 100 picks will be a big deal.
When you spoke about the trading options. They were asked about that during the press conference of how do those come about? Like, are calls made beforehand? Is it just chaotic? Is it organized chaos? And it's kind of a little bit of all three.
Yeah, that was another thing where, like, when you talk about are you going to trade up or are you going to trade back, that's where, like, full pre-draft press conference mode is in full effect, where you don't necessarily want to buy in too much to what they're saying or what people around the league are saying. Because, everyone's just trying to, like, play their cards just the right way. But I did think what Sean Payton said was interesting of they get a sense, and I've never heard anyone talk about this before, they get a sense of, like, which teams have new GMs or head coaches or which, based on their interactions before, is this a team that, hey, maybe you have an agreement in place, and then on draft night, hey, this team's going to be a little more risk averse. Maybe they're going to back out of this deal. Or maybe this team loves to trade, and they're going to be like, you're looking to move up to get, X guy.
They're going to be open to it.
Yeah, we know that
them.
This team is ready. So that was interesting. And, I think there's a sentiment that, like, I'm just using this as an example. Say Ashton Genty falls to 10, that you just call whatever team at 10 and say, like, hey, we'll give you this.
Right.
Or, last year, like, if the Broncos had thought, hey, we need to move up to get Bo Nix, hey, we're going to call the team at 9. But I think a lot of work goes in. It was interesting hearing about that of, like, hey, maybe this team, they might say they're willing to do a deal, but then on draft night, they're going to be like, actually, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to have a backup plan. And George Payton talked about that in terms of, he called it an exit plan for each pick of, hey, if you get to 20 and you don't have a guy that meets the value of the 20th pick, what's your exit plan to get out of that pick? Or if you're at pick 85 and you don't have a guy.
Yeah.
And we've seen the Broncos a couple of times. It was back in 2021. They had that quote-unquote exit plan a couple of times. They traded back twice, ended up getting Quinn Miners and Baron Browning. Obviously, Baron struggled with some injuries. He's now in Arizona. But, like, they traded back to, I think Miners went at 98, but it was after a couple of trade backs, and you still were able to get that high-quality player. So that's where – and we'll have something coming out on DenverBroncos.com about the trade histories of Sean Payton and George Payton. I think that's interesting to look at as you go to the draft. But yeah, if there's one thing we know about George Payton, he likes to move around the board, collect picks, move up when they have to. I think there's this notion that, like, he doesn't ever trade up. Well, he went up and got Javonte Williams. And before the injury, Javonte Williams was as explosive as any back in this league and still was a good pass protector down the stretch. So certainly some moves to be made. They went up and got Riley Moss. They got Marvin Mims through a trade up. The last couple of years, we've also seen them, like, they went and got Adam Troutman, who was a solid contributor. John Franklin Myers, who had a big impact on this defensive line. So a lot of options, I think, in terms of trading and moving around. But you're right. It doesn't just start draft day, but there is still an element of, you got to work some final things out.
Well, it's funny. I know you use it as an example with the Broncos taking a running back in that first round. But it's interesting when you look at what can possibly happen in that first round with that 20th pick. Now, the Broncos have 7 selections overall over the course of the draft. But that number one in that first round spot with the 20th overall pick, you could go running back. There's a lot of good running backs in this draft. But when you look at the history of kind of what teams have done, how do you see them kind of playing that out? They spoke about their history about that as well, about getting that top talent in the highest round. Yeah,
I mean, in his time in New Orleans, Sean twice selected a running back. Obviously Reggie Bush with the number 2 overall pick, and then Mark Ingram. George Payton never did it. He hasn't done it in Denver. And then also when he was in Minnesota, they got Dalvin Cook kind of early in the second round. And I thought Sean Payton said that was a first-round running back. He just happened to fall to the second round.
And George was honest saying that he benefited from the fact that they had just drafted Adrian Peterson when he got to the league too. So although that wasn't his decision, he saw the benefit of seeing a top talent like that. Obviously, we saw the career that he was able to have.
I think the thought about running backs in general is just some of the workload stuff, like do they come out of college and have a heavy workload already? And then are you putting them on a team that can use them to have success? Like I think part of the reason nationally people think Saquon had such a great year is one, he's an incredibly talented player, but also the Eagles were built to win, right? Like they were ready to go. And I think you see teams that, if you draft a running back at 2 or 3 and they struggle because the team's not there around them, then it's tough for them to like, okay, well, are they getting to their second contract by the time that team's ready to compete? That makes it tough, and maybe that's where some people don't see the value of a first-round running back. In my eyes, you look at a team like the Broncos that has a good defense, that has a really strong offensive line that was rated number 1 in pretty much every efficiency rating last year. Like that to me feels like a scenario where whether it's the first round or second round or third, whatever it might be, you can drop a running back in there and use capital on him because the team is kind of in place around you. And now you're not saying, okay, we got to spend the next 3 or 4 years getting up to speed. Like, no, we're ready to go. And I think Sean Payton used the analogy. He was asked about kind of the golf analogy of, are you playing it safe? Are you hitting an iron? Are you just trying to chip onto the green? Or are you sending a driver? And he said, like, he's been known to hit driver on a lot of holes where maybe you should play it a little bit safe, but instead you're going for it. And so it'll be interesting to see as the Broncos try to chase the Chiefs and win the division for the first time since 2015. Do they try to quote unquote hit driver and go for a back? Both George Payton and Sean Payton didn't rule it out by any means, but they did say you've got to have a vision for that player. And then you've also just got to consider the other players on the board, right? And like, is there a more talented guy, or is this truly like your highest rated player? And Sean Payton is kind of talking about something else, but he said, if we've got Crystal sitting out available, but like we can't draft a blender because we need a blender, right? Like you still got to take that best player available. But to me, it didn't sound like they committed to taking a running back in the first round. Didn't sound like they were totally against it, which obviously they're not going to come out in this and say, hey, here's what we're doing.
Right.
But you've also, I think, just the depth of this running back class, you've got to determine, okay, hey, does Genty fall to a certain place where you're like, let's go get that guy? Or, obviously Hampton's been mentioned, Henderson from Ohio State, there's several other guys as well. Like, is one of those guys, do they decide, hey, that player's worth the 20th pick, or do we wait till the second round or third round? Or maybe the order I mentioned him in is not the order the Broncos see him in at all, right? And so, but it is clear at some point they're going to get a running back because George Payton told us that much at the annual meeting that, like, we are going to get a runner. And they thought the free agent class was maybe a little weaker there, not quite as strong or dynamic. So now it's all about which running back, when do you do that? And luckily you've got some capital now that, like, maybe you don't get one in the first round, but you can move back up in the second because you've got some additional capital. So it'll be interesting to watch. But, I mean, I would think by the end of day 2, you've probably got a running back. I just don't know where it'll be.
That's interesting when you look at the dynamic of how many scenarios have to play out for you to have your ideal draft or what you want to look for. I can't even imagine the scenarios they have written down, let alone the ones in their head. Now, when you look at the ultimate plan, which is to help Bo Nix, and, Sean Payton mentioned it, like, he's very happy that he's no longer in the position where they're looking for their quarterback. He was like, we love Bo. They've mentioned it in past press conferences. That is our franchise quarterback. Now you're looking at the best pieces to build around him. You mentioned the offensive line. I believe that Bo was one of the least sacked quarterbacks in the NFL last year. And for a rookie, that's a really big help and a really big boost there. To your point, if they get a running back, regardless of the round, that's going to be a big boost there. But how else can they help Bo in this draft?
Yeah, and it's funny when you talk about, like, figuring out what's going to happen. Unless you're the Tennessee Titans, you don't have any control over that, right?
Yeah.
Like, even Cleveland or New York, like, sitting there in the top 3 picks, like, they still have to have multiple plans because only Tennessee controls what's going to happen here.
Right.
And especially when you're at the 20th overall pick.
They could shock the world and just,
I think back to, 2019 was a little different because the Broncos had the 10th pick and they traded back to 20 where they ended up getting Noah Fant. But in 2017, when they took Garrett Bowles, he was mocked to the Broncos a lot. And then Ryan Ramczyk, who actually Sean Payton drafted in New Orleans later in the first round, those were kind of the guys that were mentioned. Everybody knew the Broncos wanted a tackle. But there was also this, like, hey, you don't know if he's going to be there. Like Christian McCaffrey was mentioned as a guy, and I think he went 8, right? Like, you just don't know what's going to happen, especially when you're that far down. Right. So you're right. You've got to have kind of all these different options. They'll go through the mock drafts. Will be a little trickier than they were like a few years ago when the Broncos picked 9th and took Surtain, just because there's more options.
Right.
But I think there's 2 things with helping Bo. One, Sean Payton said, like, hey, listen, we love Bo. We want Bo to be as good as possible, but we're not sitting in the draft room and saying, like, okay, well, how would Bo fit with this guy, right? Like, you still got to evaluate the players, and part of that, like, the vision is considered, but you still just got to pick good football players, and that'll help Bo. And then the other thing,
because Bo wants to win, and, like, Bo is a winner, and he wants the guys that are going to come in here and have that same mindset.
Right. Like, you're not just going to take a guy because, like, this guy might fit better with Bo, but this guy's much more talented. Like, you still got to add good players at all spots. And then the other thing is that, we talk about weapons, and Sean, I think he kind of smiled when someone asked about weapons. because people think, hey, tight end, like an Evan Ingram, wide receiver, like Cortland Sutton is for him. But Sean Payton views it as, hey, a weapon is also Dre Greenlaw in free agency.
Yeah.
It's Talanoa Hufanga in free agency. It's keeping Garrett Bowles at left tackle, because all those things, he was like, it's good when your quarterback doesn't get sacked or hit. It's good when they've got a running game, that doesn't get them in 3rd and 10.
Right.
It's good when you're not allowing 35 points a game and your quarterback's got to drop it back and pass every single snap. And so like those are a different type of weapon. And so yes, you want playmakers, but also like if they go out and draft a stud defensive lineman in the first round, or a stud linebacker, or whatever it might be, like that in a way is building up another area of your team, which makes things easier in turn and asks less of Bo Nix. And I don't want to like talk a ton about other teams, but think about like what Joe Burrow was asked to do this past year, because their defense struggled a little bit in Cincinnati, right? Like no matter how great Joe Burrow played this year, that's a tough scenario to be in. And
you saw it, because he would have great games and yet they would still go on to lose, and obviously the season went how it went.
So if you're able to build this team up around Bo Nix and have the team be good, that helps Bo. Now, Sean Payton did say, and one of the last things I know we wanted to talk about was wide receiver.
Yeah.
Sean did say at some point they're going to add wide receiver, or multiple, and maybe it's in the draft, maybe it's in free agency as we, the latter stages as we get close to training camp. But Sean said this at the beginning of the offseason, and he kind of reiterated it now. They like their wide receiver group. Cortland Sutton is obviously a big piece of that. Yeah. Marvin Mims took a huge step from year 1 to year 2, and I hope continues to play like he did the last 5 games, because it gave you this dynamic, explosive element.
Yeah. The speed was unmatched. Seriously. We saw that dramatically in a lot of games.
Yeah, I mean, he changed games, and I think we talked for years about like having someone that the defense fears, or that like if you're a defensive coordinator, you're like, how do we deal with this guy? Yeah. And Marvin, I think, started to show that he could be that guy based on how the Broncos used him. And then Troy Franklin and Devon Vele, we've talked about them a little bit, but just they drafted 2 guys last year. They were both day 3 picks, but the Broncos were encouraged about how they developed, and now they want to see that next step. And so, the Broncos, doesn't mean they couldn't take a wide receiver in the first round, and certainly a lot of mocks have, some different guy with Luther Burden from Missouri, Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. Like, there are options, right? But I do think it's interesting hearing Sean Payton talk about, like, we've got a lot of faith in the group we have right now.
Yeah, when you look at the sparks that you mentioned that Marvin Mims had, Troy Franklin also had similar sparks in certain passes that him and Bo were able to connect on. And just like Sean and George needed to have that consistency over the course of the last 3 drafts, your players also need to have that. And so it was encouraging for them to say, like, we like what we saw in our wide receivers, and we're excited for where their next step is going to be, and also the leadership that we have built around them to make them better. And I think one of the last things to touch on that I really liked about this press conference was just the fact that yes, your question was amazing. But also the fact that sometimes they do lean into talking to players here and kind of getting their viewpoints. George mentioned that it was not this specific draft, but he did talk to PS2 at one point about some Alabama guys or a guy that he went against. And I think it's nice to kind of have that in your toolbox of knowing that you can go to your corner piece guys to kind of get that perspective that you may not have or you may not see at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to use every resource available. Yeah. I think they said last year that even right after drafting Bo, that they said, hey, what would you think about going and get Troy Franklin on day 3? And he was like, do it. So, like, there is something to, hey, we've had the scouts out there. Yeah. We've had the combine. We've had pro days. We've had visits. They talked about the value of those top 30 visits, which I think the name kind of suggests like these are our top 30 players. It should be more just 30 visits, right? And you're getting to know these guys for a variety of different reasons and bringing them in. But like, yeah, use every possible resource at your disposal. Find out about these guys and decide, at least right now, which 7 players should be drafted to this football team. And Sean Payton said, listen, it's going to be hard to make this roster at certain spots, but that's what you want. You don't want a bunch of holes on your roster going into the draft. You want to be able to be in a good spot like the Broncos are, draft some good football players, and get ready to compete.
Well, like they mentioned, you can never have too much information. Well, that will do it for this edition of Altitude Advantage. Once again, I'm your host and team reporter, Elisa Hernandez, alongside our lead writer and draft wizard, Aric DiLalla. For more draft coverage, make sure you head over to denverbroncos.com.